to reach out to us. You've already found our website, and all of you here too are encouraged to go onto the website. So I have been a member here for about 10 years, maybe more. I'm on the board, I'm on the finance committee, help out with the moderating duties. There's lots to do, and we always want to do more. So definitely bring your friends, encourage more people to come. We really would like to grow our community like so many people do. I think we're doing some really good things here. And so I want to give you the briefest of description of what humanism is. And so humanism is a progressive philosophy of life that, without theism or other supernatural beliefs, affirms our ability and responsibility to lead ethical lives of personal fulfillment that aspire to the greater good. And so I'm going to introduce our speaker. Doug Fraser is our speaker today. And he is talking, I think we're already up here, finding permanent solutions to the growing homelessness crisis in Chicago and the U.S. And as you see, this is his title. Chicago Health Initiative is a consortium of business, residential, religious, social service, institutional, and volunteer leaders striving to promote an atmosphere of dignity and compassion toward those in need by providing access to food, health services, shelter, and employment. The Chicago Health Initiative works to educate local businesses and residents on how they can help ease the plight of the homeless, disadvantaged, and out-of-work individuals and improve their well-being, self-esteem, and productivity. Previously, Doug was executive director of Care for Real, a Northside food pantry serving over 5,000 clients a month. His background is also in local government, having spent 4 years as chief of staff of Alderwoman Mary Ann Smith, 48th Ward, as well as involved in downtown business experience, serving as planning director at the Greater North Michigan Avenue Association for 6 years. And Doug just told me too, he had previously been an assistant to Mayor Daley, I think, yeah, so that goes back, been in Chicago helping for quite a while. Our presentations cover a lot of topics: arts, science, philosophy. This one really, I think, and I guess we're going to find out, I think covers a variety of subjects from social justice and charitable activities, and maybe something about how the government works. I'm not sure. We'll see. And after his presentation, we'll have a brief intermission, and then we will have plenty of time for Q&A. Hopefully, if that goes long, Doug will stay and answer more of your questions. So without further ado, please help me introduce, welcome, Doug Fraser.
Hi, folks. Thank you for having me. This is a great time to be talking about these issues. There's lots going on. I will warn you that the first part of the presentation is a little depressing, and you're going to think, oh my goodness. But then we get to some better things and some opportunities later on, and we'll see if that cheers you up or maybe even gives you a reason to act on some things. One thing interesting about Rick said, and it reflects changing times only, is I did work for Alderman Mary Ann Smith. And she used to insist that it's alderman because Chicagoans wanted an alderman. That's what they wanted. But the world has changed. It's now alderperson. And, you know, we adapt. On we go. So let me get right to it. Let's see if I can work this. Look at this. One thing that I want to add to what Rick said, which was a great introduction, is that we do meals and case management with 9 different partners around the city. And what we do there is we train volunteers to do resource location, assistance at community meals, and sometimes pantries, with the goal of building capacity, resilience, and community in neighborhoods. So if you think to yourself, that's something I want to do. I want to go to the west side or the near south side, in another month, a location on the north side, and help people who are in trouble directly, we can teach you to do that. Okay, so that's just the sort of the pitch. Right now in Chicago, I'm going to cover the scope and challenges of homeless issues in Chicago and the influx of immigrants. Both of those things may make you sad. Then I'm going to go to the opportunity presented now. Bring Chicago home, the ballot referendum, and cover some ground on that. and an initiative that started March 7th, which is the combination of the two distinct shelter systems. So if you guys have followed this issue, there is one system of shelter for Chicagoans and one system of shelter for newly arrived migrants. There's lots of challenges that are created by that dynamic, and over this summer, the city and state have committed to merging those shelters. So that's an opportunity to do things better for everyone. First, I want to talk about what we mean by homeless. And there are lots of estimates that float around. The one that went out in the notice to you is 68,000, and that is an excellent estimate of people who are in suffering from homelessness, from housing insecurity. So that's going to include people who are doubled up or tripled up. It's going to include people who are couch surfing. It's going to include people who are in hotels or temporary settings to manage the situation they're in, as well as the more classic definitions of homelessness, which is people in shelters and encampments, in storage lockers and places like that, and simply out on the street. So that's a really good way of looking at the number of people that we're able to measure in using various sources who are in pain because of this issue. Then I want to go on to some others that you will hear bandied about. People formally accessing the homeless services. That's 37,000 a year. And that gets a little interesting. So these are the people that are going to appear on the Homeless Management Information System, HMIS, reference below in the course of, in this case, I think it was 2022. You'll note that's a lot less than the 68,000, but those are the people who've chosen to turn to a government resource, either through a delegate agency or directly, to get assistance. Turns out not to be a great technique. 83% of those people will time off the system without us knowing their outcome. And this is part of the depressing part. So the vast majority of people that enter that system just disappear off it when they time out, after I believe it's 3 months now, without ever having been helped, and we don't know what happens to them. In any given month, the HMIS system monthly active cases, how many people are on that system saying, called up within the last 3 months and said, I need help, I don't have a place to sleep. I will make a quick correction there. It's actually 12,000. I checked that this morning before I got here, but I didn't change it. So if you're keeping score, you can cross out the 4 and put in a 2. I added the CPS students identified as homeless because I think that's interesting, right? So it is actually more than the actual number who appear in the official government document. And you would think as Chicagoans, we would say kids are one of the most important things and we need to have these systems connected, but they're not. Point and time count, and this is something you will see a lot of times when people say homelessness. The point and time count is every city that receives housing and urban development funds to assist with homeless, at least once a year has to go out and count the number of people who are on the street. There's a lot of challenges with how that's done. As an advocate, and this is reflected with many other advocates, we think it's a significant undercount. But the city of Chicago does it in January, and this January, they went out and counted 6,000 people who were in shelters or in places not suitable for human habitation. Of those people, for the first time, they added new arrivals, right? So those would have been the people in the police stations, the people who were at O'Hare and various places like that, as well as Chicagoans. And now breaking down the Chicago number, of the people they counted who had been long-term residents here, 3,000 were in shelters, and remember that number 3,000, it will come back to us in a couple minutes, and 1,000 they counted out on the street. Just to give you a reference of how hard it is to count people out on the street, the city specifically goes to certain census tracts in certain areas and counts who's in those and extrapolates from that a larger number. In June of this year, I decided to embark on a project that I stopped because I couldn't do it. I got the list from the city of 93 locations where they said homeless people were living. I went to 2 communities. One was the northwest side of the city of Chicago, and I went to every single location, and I went to Hyde Park because we do work in the Bronzeville area in Hyde Park, and I went to every single location. 40% of the locations were wrong. And that's not a flaw of sort of how to run this system. It's because people move so much. Right, so you're in one location now, you're going out, this is people outside, you're going to another location, the city's putting in a bike path, they take down your tent, you put in another location. So that speaks to how very difficult it is to get these counts. I wasn't able to verify those locations, and I stopped because I simply didn't have the manpower to document everything that was going on at all those locations. But the city, again, says there's about 1,000 people sleeping outside. So you can move between 68,000 as a number to look at to 1,000 as a number to look at. And so the real answer is no one knows with any exactitude, and it depends on how you define homelessness, how you count it, and the time of year, right? Because going back to in January, there are going to be fewer people outside than there are in June. Okay, now this is again not a great thing to talk about. If you're in trouble, right? So you're outside and you need help. So what does the city tell you to do? Call 311. What happens when you actually call 311? Anybody ever tried it over homelessness issues? Yeah, me neither anymore. I don't do it. Most providers don't do it because it's worthless. Only 10 to 15% of shelter requests are fulfilled. That means as many, and this was done in a presentation to the Continuum of Care last year by a group from UIC that pulled the data from the 311. They had to FOIA it. They went through that data and they said, what's going on with this? The caveat here is the data is very, very messy. So unclosed cases, unconfirmed what happened. So this is a general discussion, but these numbers are not going to be exact. And one thing we have to do as a city is start keeping better data here. But the fact is, you call 311 for help, the odds are you don't get it. Anywhere over 80% of people who call don't get helped. If they do show up to pick you up, 2/3 of those requests take more than 12 hours. So you're out on the street, you call for help, it's going to be more than 12 hours before the van arrives to pick you up. What that tells you is the only people who get picked up are in emergency rooms, police stations, or other places where they're able to wait for very long periods of time. The rule is they'll pick you up wherever you call and ask to be picked up, but that just doesn't happen. So when people come to our meals or to the food pantries and say, I have nowhere to sleep, we say, you got to go to an emergency room. And you all know the problem that causes. Last year during the winter, Northwestern downtown, which is a key location where we send people, had an 18-hour wait for regular patients to be seen in their emergency room. And part of that wait was the sheer volume of homeless that they were keeping and having to address in a series, three different locations within the hospital. It makes an impact on everybody. Hospitals, and these are from the south side, these numbers, where patients, it should say guests, waited up to 10 days. So you called from U of C emergency room, and you were there for 10 days before the van came and picked you up. So the system, why is this happening? Why is this system so inefficient and such a mess? Okay. In 2012, the city of Chicago had 5,177 shelter beds. And those beds were only full 6 to 10 days a year, which means the odds were, unless it was really, really cold out, you could call, you could get into a bed, and you had a safe place to sleep for the night. Not a perfect place. Some of these were congregate shelters, some of these were rough places, but you could get inside. And you could stay there so long as you obeyed by the rules until you sorted things out. Now, shelters aren't the greatest places to be, but the very fact that people need to get into them tells you it's better than being out on the street. Today, we have 3,200, a drop of 40% of shelter beds. What happened? The instrument through which shelter beds went away was the reimbursement. So currently, the city pays $26 a day for you to keep for a per day per bed in a shelter. The costs are $70 to $100 a day. Due to advocacy efforts, that $46 figure is in a recent RFP, right, a request for proposals. Thank you. Everybody's going proposal out there. Yeah. To build new shelters and add shelter beds. And we'll see if anyone takes that. But it's still far below what the shelter providers say their cost is. So obviously what's happened is those providers like Franciscan House and PGM and Cornerstone that can rely on philanthropy and other sources for funding have remained. Those shelters that can't are gone. It also affects the quality of care in a shelter, because if you're running a deficit, you have less money to spend on social workers, less money to spend on repairs. Earlier this year, I got a donation of fans from an organization, and we moved them all to Franciscan House because they had no air conditioning in the summer in one of their rooms. So there just aren't the resources to keep the quality up. And there's another impact of this, and this is out of a report from the Charge Group. The Charge is a very interesting group. It was founded during COVID when the city of Chicago ordered the shelters emptied. And then, and these guys just refused. They said, we're not going to do it, and they banded together, and it is those larger providers that I talked about, including UIC, Rush, and a group of other people who said, we got to find out, and they came to a different conclusion, which was they spread out the beds as opposed to everybody having to leave. But they did a review in December 22 when we had a cold snap, and they found that because people couldn't get inside, approximately 15 homeless people died due to cold exposure or weather-related injuries such as carbon monoxide poisoning. Further, they found that over the course of the whole winter, 60 people died with cold exposure as a primary or secondary cause of death. So they either simply froze to death or they were outside and the cold contributed to their death. So people are actually dying because we don't have enough spaces to put people. I told you this was going to be depressing. Yeah, so. And why did we allow the number of shelters to decline? We actually did it for a very good reason. First, there appeared to be fewer and fewer street homeless in the city of Chicago, and that's a positive thing as a result of some of the initiatives that had happened in previous years, previous to this. And that's getting more people into apartments, intercepting more people going into homelessness, and so that actual number appeared to be dropping. It's certainly not dropping anymore. But the second thing is we went to what we call the housing first model. And if you look at the cities who address homelessness best, Columbus, Ohio, Salt Lake City, and European cities like Helsinki and Vienna, they all use this model. But here's the key to the model. You call up, you say, I'm in trouble. Maybe they pick you up and put you in a shelter for a day. It's not the best place to be, but they move you quickly into a unit in which you are by yourself, you are safe, you have time to get your life together and to figure out what you're going to do, and then they address whatever problems put you in that moment. Are you fighting with your family? Do you have a drug issue? Or is it mental health? What's going on? But they get you housed first before they address other things. And HUD says, well, first let me say we have the continuum of care, which is mandated by the federal government. Every city that takes federal money for homelessness has a continuum of care. Says there are about 8,000 permanent supportive housing units. Those are the units you would be moved into at this moment. HUD says you can allow 30 days, and 30 days is the maximum. You want to beat that time between the time I say, okay, we're going to put you in a unit, and you actually get the keys and you're in your unit. As of, again, this is the second error that's in the presentation. That's actually September of 2023, and it's 83 days. So again, that's one of the things I checked this morning. But basically, if the city says they're going to put you in a unit, it's 3 months before you get in that unit. We don't have enough units, and we use our units inefficiently. If you look at the March 17, 2022, HUD dinged the city of Chicago because they had a 21% vacancy rate among these units. That 1 in 5 units was empty while people were sleeping outside. Okay? And that, it's just unacceptable. I'm going to add one more thing and get to the summary in this part. We do a poor job building these units. In fact, we add about 114 units a year since 2012. It obviously has not been enough, and many of these units have staggering costs associated with them. So, in the Invest Southwest initiative, the Lightfoot administration, the average cost of the units that they are bringing online, affordable housing units, is $653,000 a unit to build. The average construction cost of a luxury downtown unit, this is based off Sterling Bay and the work that they're doing, is $455,000. So we are paying over $200,000 for some of these units, which you could simply buy a unit in a luxury apartment, and this one listed had a pool, a fitness room, a store in the downstairs. So we do not build these units efficiently. There is an argument to be made that no one builds them truly efficiently, that the funding mechanisms and all the other things that go into this process drive up the cost. Although when I spoke with someone who builds them, he said there's a bunch of units that were contracted before that are at $355. So actually came in under those levels. So it can be done We're just not doing it well at the moment. Okay, here's the summary of this part. There are too few shelter beds. You get in crisis, we don't have any place to put you. There are too few permanent supportive housing units, so that even if we get you into a shelter, we can't get you out. We're lousy at placing people, as I said, and we're very inefficient building new units. So what I want to suggest, and I'll get to it, is maybe some different ideas. But next, I'm going to do a brief summary of the influx of immigrants, because this is in the news. So hold those ideas in your head, because in order to get to solutions, we're going to put these two streams of issues together. I'm just going to go through some facts here, and this is off the MMRR briefing decks. So if you're curious about what's going on, the City of Chicago does a presentation every week or every 2 weeks, depending on what's going on, and then you can go on the website and pull these down to get accurate numbers. And like homelessness, there's a lot of different stuff reported, but this is probably as good as you're going to get. The city has tracked 36,400 some new arrivals since I think it was August of 22, or it was when this began over a year ago. Of those are people who reported that they were going to Chicago from a place like Texas, or were shipped here from a place like Texas. That doesn't mean all of them stayed. It doesn't mean all of them entered into the city's system, so you'll see some discrepancies in the numbers. But it means that they know these people came in by bus, by plane, in different ways into the city, and they've tracked that number. Currently, there's about 12,000 residents, 11,795, and 23 active shelters run by the city and state. To me, this was interesting because it says city and state. I thought they were all city shelters. If there's a state shelter in Chicago, I don't know which one it is, but I think that's interesting. And then this, I think the next section of this is kind of interesting. So at March 5th at 2024, the last update they did, at 8:30 in the morning, there were 10 people awaiting placement. 5 were in police districts, 1 was at O'Hare, and 4 were at the landing zone. The landing zone is an area set up for buses to come in and people to come out and begin to get connected to services. Interesting about this, and this is where opportunity starts to come in, the number of migrants arriving has been dropping. At the beginning of January, where it says high, there were 28 shelters with 14,600 people in it. Today, there are 23 shelters with 11,000, roughly 12,000 people in them. So the numbers of migrants entering into the shelter system is dropping. And that's a positive thing. And it is, I will get to the evictions you may have heard about, some of which are supposed to happen today, in just a moment. Why? Well, people are leaving for other destinations. There's a natural outflow. They come, they get into Chicago, they get into a shelter. Maybe they never intended to stay. They spend a couple of days, they move on. Maybe they intended to stay. They think, I got a better offer in Milwaukee, or I've got family in Maine, or wherever people might be shipping out to. But people are leaving on their own. Locating other housing. So there's Catholic Charities that is working in housing people. There's some private and other organizations, community organizations that are working on housing people. So people would be getting housing and moving out of the shelter into housing. The most important reason, according to the city, is a decrease in pace of arrival. So if you look at this map, can I do this? Well, right here is one of those peaks. That's in December. And you can see that it just starts dropping after that and comes down to a much lower level. They expect that level to stay low. I can't verify what I'm about to say. I can only tell you what comes across in the task force. They believe that Texas will begin sending migrants before the Democratic National Convention. And in order to precipitate a mess, and they've said this like 3 times, I have no evidence to support it, but it's just classic politics. They will begin sending people, increasing the pace of people coming before that, and create a crisis. We'll see what happens. Okay. Anyway, I'm just going to hold, but here's the thing that I want to say about this, this decrease in numbers. We know that there are hundreds of shelter beds now open because the number of people has dropped faster than the number of beds in shelters. And so starting about 2 weeks ago, there started to be pressure from advocates saying, hold on, we got people in tents, we got people in encampments, we got people in storage lockers, open up the spaces. And the city said, no, 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 we're not going to do that until March 5th, when they send out a note saying, okay, we're going to bring the systems together. So a little bit of sensibility, perhaps there was pressure, perhaps there was timing was just right for all that to happen. But there are extra beds to get people off the street, and we need to use them for that. Oops. There we go. All right, guys, I have no idea where I am now. This is, yeah, here we go. I want to cover very briefly the event that's supposed to start today, which was, I'm not going to read through all this. If you can, we'll certainly make this available if you're interested. The city had said that they were going to evict some 5,000 people starting today, and that would go over the course of 2 months. They gradually go out. For the third time, they put in a new set of rules right beforehand. That was on Friday. And so they're actually only going to be moving 34 people today. And then the same thing I would expect to have happen at this point with those people, the 2,119 people who are supposed to start leaving at the beginning of April. It feels sometimes like there is not a plan here or an idea of what's going to happen, and so we keep changing what we say. We'll see. I do think the last point is somewhat interesting, which is that of the people who were in the shelter on March 5th, roughly 5,300 were eligible for rental assistance from the state of Illinois for 3 months, and close to 7,000 of those people are not eligible. Here's where some of this becomes really important. There is an impact on meals, pantries, resources. At one point, the city of Chicago shut down access to City Key, an ID for migrants, by closing the events in which City Key was issued because they were being overwhelmed and Chicagoans couldn't get City Key. So, and we do service at a food pantry on the west side, which before this started served about 200 people a day, and now has served up to 800 people a day. And the vast majority of those increases are new arrivals. What that means is those people who have traditionally used that service are often unable to access that service, have much longer lines, and get fewer of the precious items like milk, eggs, diapers, that kind of stuff. On a meal that we do at 721 North LaSalle, we have served 150 homeless a night, and we've done that meal. I've been part of it for 10 years. It's been there for 20 years. Over the past year, we have served on average 60 to 70 homeless a night, meaning almost half that population has been displaced out, and sometimes 100 to 300 migrants have come into that meal. So it's an impact on us that fortunately has been fine, but it also, if you were coming into that meal to access housing resources or legal resources or anything along those lines, you may not be able to do it anymore. So there is an impact, and it's being felt by people who are at the very bottom of the economic and social scale. It's there. So it matters a great deal. If you're going to move 10,000 people out onto the street, where are they going to get food? Where are they going to get resources? What's going to happen? And there doesn't seem to be any conversation like that going on. Now I'm going to switch gears to a couple of opportunities, and maybe you'll leave this with thinking, oh, it's not so grim. Things might change. I hope. In 1 year, they stood up 15,000 shelter beds. So we've been arguing for almost 10 years, we need more beds, we need more beds. We got nothing. Shut out. 1 year, 15,000. You can do it if you want to do it, and you don't have to let go of them. Okay? I realize some of these beds are very expensive. The deals cut were very poor. If this were an omelet, there would be a lot of broken eggs around it. I don't care. You have shelter beds. People are suffering and dying on the street. We need to keep those beds. We know now that we can make them, and we know that we can keep them. And that's part of the push that started a couple of weeks ago, saying, look, there's an opportunity here, don't let it go. And then on March 7th, we get this, which is the One System Initiative overview. It felt like perhaps it was a little bit rushed. That's fine. In which the city and the state are combining to merge these systems and address the question of what's going to happen to the shelter beds. So I put their objectives on here. You can read through them if you like, but it's about roadmaps, eliminating duplication, getting feedback, and then coming up with a plan. And here's something else they got completely right. The plan is supposed to be in place by the end of June, okay? So June isn't the time when homeless are really in crisis. It's miserable, it's bad. It's October, it's November, it's December. That's when people freeze. So if you're going to address this issue, you have to do it in the summer. And that's why the timing on this is right. For me, this looks like an incredibly compressed process. I don't know what you do in government that only takes you 4 months and then you implement. But let's see what happens. But think of this as a really positive thing. The city has understood that it has to act. The state has become a leading push in making this happen, and we need to make it happen. Now, I'm going to come, Chicagoans here? Okay. Even if you're not a Chicagoan, you know the city is looking at a ballot referendum this election about funding homeless services through an increase in the transfer tax. So I'm going to touch on some of that, and then I'm going to give you some ideas. So a quick summary is there decrease for some people and an increase for other people, and projected to generate about $100 million a year. I'm not going to speak to the numbers of generation. I have no idea. I see different things out of LA and other places that tried to do something like this. It also, you know, I think about, well, COVID, well, the change in office, there are so many things going on in the real estate market that I can't evaluate it. But using the figure that they put out there for discussion, the question is, where will that money be spent? The language in the ballot basically says providing permanent affordable housing and the services necessary to obtain and maintain permanent housing in the city of Chicago. If you remember this argument coming together, there was a set of people who said only housing, only housing. And there was a set of people that said, no, you need to do services and whatever is necessary to obtain and maintain permanent housing. And that made its way into the enabling referendum vote. And that becomes really important, and you'll see why in just a second, that it isn't simply about bricks and mortar. It's about the other sets of services, or can be about the other sets of services in community and in different locations that can keep people from slipping into housing and that can help people directly when they're homeless but aren't necessarily in a permanent supportive units. So what exactly will the funds be spent on will be determined by an ordinance after the referendum. In other words, after the referendum, if it is approved, which is by no means sure, but if it is approved, then City Council will have to pull together an ordinance that says where the money goes. This is what I want you to think about, and sort of germane to why I'm standing up here. The number of homeless individuals you can help in Chicago with $100 million. Ready? If you build affordable housing units like they have contracted in the last 2 years of the Lightfoot administration, you get 153 units. It's crazy what we pay for these things. So there's always going to be a set of people that need supportive housing. People with mental illnesses, people who slip in and out of drug addiction. We can't get away from that if we're going to take care of people. But this is an extraordinarily expensive way to address this issue. Here's another alternative. Purchase single-family homes to give to families in Inglewood. I picked Inglewood because that's one of the places where they're building one of these really expensive models. But you could give 617 people homes with more than one bedroom in them in some of these neighborhoods. Why is that important? And I'm going to go back to all the way to the beginning of this conversation when I told you that the vast majority of people who call up and say they need help, they're homeless, they don't get it. But they don't show up on the death as dead, they don't get institutionalized, they don't go to jail. What happens to them? Their families happen to them. Their grandma happens to them. Their cousins happen to them. If you ask the people that I serve who transition out of homelessness, how did this happen? It's usually my sister. It's my grandma. It's somebody who steps back into their lives and gives them another chance and gives them an opportunity to transition out, and they've had enough difficulty, enough challenge that they take that and stick with it. That's how most people get out of homelessness. Not me, not the government. It's the people who love them that get that done. So, give the people who love them homes. Then they've got a place to live. Then they've got investment in the neighborhood. Then you're maintaining the neighborhood, and then you're giving them an opportunity to help those people who need help. It's one idea. Nursing home setting. Some of the people that I serve, there's no alternative. They need to be in that daily managed care setting. You could put 2,000 people into a nursing home setting with that amount of money. Prison. If that offends you, good. Because right now that's one of the policies we use for dealing with homeless. Both voluntarily, I've had guys commit crimes to get inside, and if you're causing enough trouble because you're homeless, that's where you're going to end up. You could fund roughly 2,600 people a year in prison, if that's the way you want to do it. I'm not recommending it. I'm just telling you what's happening. Here's another model that I like much better. Permanent supportive housing services in a private home setting, right? So you've got someone who's got issues. They're going to need a social worker. They need mental health care. You can put 5,000 people, keep them in either their home or their family's home or a setting in which you don't build the unit itself, and provide these services directly to them that you would in a supportive housing setting. I also put number of one-bedroom apartments in Avondale. You all know where Avondale is? I happen to know some of you live right next to it. So that's a northwest side neighborhood. And the reason I put Avondale is I always believed that integration is better. If you go back to the Gautreaux decision that said that segregating African Americans in specific poor neighborhoods, you have to create public housing opportunities in many other neighborhoods, was a much better model for integrating people into society, into opportunities. There's a statistic, and this is pretty old, but I think it probably still holds, that 70% of people get their first job through people they know who are employed, or relatives, or family, or neighborhoods. 70%. But if you are pushed into a community where nobody's working, everybody's challenged, you don't have that opportunity. So put people in mixed income integrated communities like Avondale, you could do 5,200. If people want to stay where they grew up and where they feel at home and connected, that's a positive thing too. If that's a place like Inglewood, you could do 8,000. Then I want to get to the last thing, emergency fund services. Okay, and this speaks to catching people before they end up homeless. Right? So how do you get homeless? You can't pay the utility bills. You can't pay the rent. You've got issues with money. You've got issues along those stress problems with that. You can you can help 20,000 people with $100 million at the rate that All Chicago does it through their existing emergency fund. So here you have a choice if you're looking at $100 million. You can do 153 people or you can do 20,000 people. And it depends on what you want to spend the money on. And that, I think, is the most important part of this conversation, which is if the ballot referendum goes through, the real question will be, are we going to do the most expensive option? Or are we going to get smart and do what other cities and other locations do prevention instead of remediation, and just essentially keeping communities strong and investing in communities instead of creating settings in which poor people are put in poor neighborhoods and isolated. Because think of what Invest Southwest has done. And now I'm going to make a political statement. It's gone to the poorest neighborhoods in Chicago and built housing at an incredibly expensive cost and then filled it up with people who are too poor to live in the poorest neighborhoods in Chicago. I just don't think that's positive. And I would challenge the notion that any form of economic development will follow the application of that model. Okay. Summary. We need to explore solving the immediate shelter bed crisis as we merge the two existing systems. And this probably won't be the last time we have an influx of major people into this city. It's happened in the past that we've had influxes. Think the Great Depression when people moved west. Think the migration out of the southern states into Chicago before, which created the redlining in the ghettos that we are still addressing today, in which we didn't account for this massive influx of people. So we need to solve the existing shelter bed crisis, and we need to pay attention to what has happened now, take lessons off of what we have done successfully and what we haven't. We need to focus away from building new units to keeping families together and people in the neighborhoods they call home if that's their choice, and in other neighborhoods if they don't. We need to help people as they begin to enter crisis, that's the emergency fund model, not just after they become homeless. It's both a more ethical and cost-efficient approach. And we actually have the opportunity right in front of us right now to begin doing these things. Merging the two systems together, and creating a funding stream to apply to the other things. What can you do about it? Okay? For some of you, I don't have an answer. For some of you, you can vote on March 19th and vote what you think is right. I have lots of friends who disagree with the statements I'm making today for lots of reasons. I respect that, but you know what I think. We should get the ballot initiative done, and then we should make sure the money goes to the right place to the very best of our ability. And here's the other thing, and again, I'm getting into a little bit of politics here. Anybody know the turnout for the last mayoral election, the percent of eligible voters who went to the polls? 31%. That means if Mayor Johnson got 51% of that vote against Paul Vallis, he got 16% of the eligible voters in the city of Chicago. And every alderman in the city is in the same boat, is in the same situation. Okay? That means that your vote has a far greater impact than you might think it is, and your opinion has a far greater impact than you might think, because the margin for error at this moment is really slim. So weigh in. Tell your alderman, tell your mayor. You know, we'll put this deck online. If you want to download the numbers and send it to them, go ahead. Use it however you want to make this work. But that's one thing you can do right away. And if you want to do something at a direct level, I will put you to work at one of the locations where we work. How'd I do? It's green, am I still good?
Well, thank you.
Sure.
Well, thank you. That's a lot. This issue is a lot. There's a lot of information here, and so definitely think of what questions you'd like to clarify what's going on, what we might do. I know I had questions about, well, what about, not only, as you said, what could I do personally, what can a group like the Ethical Humanist Society do? What can a city like Skokie, we are Ethical Humanist Society of Chicago, but we're in Skokie, and what the other cities are doing. I'm curious about that. I don't know if you have answers to that, but a lot of questions came up for me because this is a lot of information. It's a complicated issue. It really feels just like a lot, and a bit overwhelming. And I think we all sitting here would like to solve this problem, and I'm glad you're helping us lead the charge. Before our Q&A, we are going to take a brief intermission. We're going to play some music, and we are asking you to help donate to this society, the Ethical Humanist Society of Chicago. We recommend $5, but we would accept any amount, more or much more or less. Happy to take it. There's QR codes posted around the room, in the lobby. There's a basket in the back, and you can go online and to ethicalhumanistsociety.org and donate to us as well to keep programs like this running. So a brief intermission and we'll be back.
I'm back on.
Okay, welcome back. We're going to get going. We're going to get Doug Fraser back here and up to the podium in a moment. I want to prompt you to ask questions, to formulate questions. We're going to use the microphone that's off to my left here. To step up to the microphone, you can queue if a lot of people want to ask them. You can post questions online. I've already gotten one online. And then we're going to, I don't know how many questions we're going to get, so Doug, I'm going to get you to come back up this way, and we'll see. But try to stick to the questions, at least so everyone can get an opportunity to ask their questions. Let's go. Thanks.
Hi, everybody. Glad to be back.
So Doug, I want to follow up on you had the, this is something I had not heard before. You said that there was a dramatic decrease in the number of beds over the last decade.
Yes.
So I guess my question is, I think a lot of people who live in the city have noticed over the last 5 years that tents are sprouting up where they didn't exist anymore. You know, that you walk in parks and other areas where a decade ago there were not tents, and now there are tents. So I guess I have a couple of points to my question. I think a lot of people have a stereotype of homeless people being mentally ill. How much of this is truly mental illness? How much is an economic issue? You know, that maybe the economy's worsened, that housing is more expensive? And how much is just, like you said, that there's been a dramatic decrease in the number of beds that anybody can go to who needs a place to stay?
Yeah, so you covered a lot of really important ground. So there has been that, the increase, of course, was well-intentioned in a way. It was to do housing first and to allow the number of units, the beds to drop while we increase the number of housing units, but we didn't do it. Now we have too few beds, not enough housing units. So that's absolutely an impact. The number of homeless are actually out in the street, and now you get into the question of how valid is the pit count. And I would ask you to go back and think about when I talked about trying to do my project of cataloging who was in what encampments where, and the mobility of people. And my wife is staring at me right now because she knows I'm about to get into details. And this is a hard thing to explain. So they count using an algorithm. So they say there's high concentrations of homeless, medium concentrations of homeless, and low concentrations of homeless. There's say 10 of each category, so they count 1 and they multiply by 10. But if you have an extraordinarily mobile population and it's moving and you get the wrong one for your algorithm to count, you significantly drop the number or raise or number or drop the number of how many people get counted in that outside count. The core of what I want to say is the algorithm doesn't work and the count is not that accurate. Previously, in earlier decades, they did every single census tract, but they don't do every single census tract anymore. So you don't really know how many people are outside at a given point, period. So all of us who work in this field say there are a lot more people outside, they are a lot more permanent, and the count is just challenging in that way. So there are more people. I would go, there's lots of mental health, lots of drugs, lots of other issues involved. But let me point out something fundamental about the people I serve. 85% are African American and older. If it were simply mental health that is affecting this, you would not have 80% out of one group. But not surprisingly, the vast majority of homeless come out of the poorest group in the city of Chicago. And that speaks to economic, social opportunity, and the history of the communities in which they live. So that tells you, I mean, am I making sense here? That economics is a huge part of it. I would also say that last year, the rental rate in the poorest communities in the city went up 14%. So if you've got people who are right on that margin, who are just hanging on and you jack up the rent, somebody's got to go, something's got to break. And that is probably a strong reason why you're seeing out of the African American communities more people ending up homeless. Andrea, I don't know if I covered everything or just sort of. What did I miss?
The decrease in the beds, right, which is one of the points that you had on there, that.
Yeah.
that There's, I think you said there's thousands less beds.
Yeah.
Now than there were a decade ago.
Right. So we are far, even with, so basically, if the homeless amount stays the same, you would be seeing thousands more people on the street than you did a decade ago. The intention was probably good, the impact is bad.
Thank you for your presentation and for your work. 3 questions. You mentioned that of the migrants in the shelter, there's like 5,000 that are not eligible for rental assistance. What is the criteria on that? Second, you were showing the 8,500 units I forget which community on this. Englewood,
Yeah.
thank you. In Englewood, where people could be housed, are you saying that there are 8,500 vacant units? And if you could elaborate on that.
Sure.
And then also heard about the absence of single-room occupancy units and how that was zoned away, and restoring that would be a possible solution. So take it away.
Yeah. So 3 good questions. Migrants, rental assistance, units in Englewood, and SROs.
Yes.
So migrant assistance, it's simply a timing issue. If you arrive before one point, the state would give you rental assistance, and then the state cut it off. So everyone who's got rental assistance arrived before, I don't remember what the exact date is, a certain time. Originally they had 6 months, now they only have 3 months help. And anyone who came after that point doesn't get assistance. If you want to know why, you'd have to ask Mr. Pritzker what the decision point was. Englewood, I'm not saying there are that many units or vacant units. I was using that as an example to say at the price points of a neighborhood like Englewood, that's how many people you could put into an apartment with that amount of money. So I was giving an example of really what I wanted to do is emphasize the difference between how inefficient we are when we build new units versus to utilize existing units in a community. And the final point, SROs, and it's a huge point. If those of you who know, there used to be many, many more single-room occupancy buildings in the city of Chicago. We have a long history and a long tradition of them. Most of them have closed down. I don't know what the exact numbers are, but there are very few left. So that is a well-run SRO can be a fine place to live. Take a look at Lawson House. There are a number of them around the city that are very positive, solid communities in which people who are single, don't need a lot of space, live. But we just don't do it as a city anymore. One of the key reasons for the demise of SROs, incidentally, was crack cocaine. Which is, and I talked with the guy who ran, do you know the guy who runs Shreehack? Okay, he was one of the larger, he owned like 5 SRO buildings and he was selling them off, and he said it's crack. Because when when heroin or alcohol, you have a lag time between when people start to go south, when things get bad, an opportunity to intervene, an opportunity to know what's happening. But with crack cocaine, it's like that. 1 month they're fine, by the end of the next month, it's a disaster. And I'm gonna add one more thing about the tents, is I started delivering food with Orange Tent this year, who put the tents up in a number of the tents up. And it has been maybe 5 years since I actually did direct outreach at some of these encampments. And many of them are an absolute disaster. There's garbage strewn all over the place. There's limbs sticking out of the sides of tents of people who are passed out. They're a disaster. And they weren't a disaster 5 years ago. Some of them were, but the majority were not. And when I asked the folks at Night Ministry in Heartland, I said, what happened here? Was this COVID with night? No, fentanyl. The introduction of these artificial opiates, is that opioids? Is that? But here's the key to some of these newer drugs. You take heroin, it's 12 hours until you need another fix, if that, okay? So you can take heroin. Some people function on it for many, many years. Fentanyl is 4 hours between fixes. So you are that's the only thing you think about when you get on those drugs. That's it. It's incredibly addictive, and it's such a short lag time, so that the encampments, you used to come into an encampment, there might be an area where people were messy, and then there would be these large areas where people were maintaining it. They would sweep. They had garbage carts. They had areas where food was allowed and areas where food wasn't allowed. It was run like a community. Some of the ones in Uptown had mayors, they had fire chiefs, they had essentially formed a functioning community. That's much, much harder when that lag time between fixes is 4 hours and people are just out of control. So that's a little addendum to what you asked. I'm sorry.
Hi. Thanks, Doug, for your great talk and your
Thank you.
really important work. So I have a question. Right at the beginning, you asked about you mentioned something called timing out. Can you describe what that is? And also explain to me, if someone times out and they're then evicted, what are they eligible for in terms of ongoing services and what happens to them?
Yeah, so timing out, so many years ago, they used to run an extensive list of people. You came in, HMIS, you said, I need help, and you would stay on that list, and they weren't sure who was there or who wasn't. So they began instituting a policy, I think originally it was 6 months, that if in 6 months you weren't in touch with your social worker or interacted with the homeless management information system in some way, they removed you from the list. And then they lowered that down to 1 month, which was crazy, and then they brought it back up, I think, again to 3 months. But essentially what 3 months does is that everybody who times out, I think it's between 1,000 to 2,000 people a month, we could actually calculate the math off this if we wanted to go back and dig into it, a similar number of people have joined. So that list, that active list, stays fairly constant, 12,000 to 14,000, but every month there's people entering in and there's people timing out. Timing out means you disappear. There's whatever happens to you, you have to start again, you're on your own. There is no tracking of people who don't get picked up, and there's no tracking of people who leave.
Does that mean at the point at which you time out, like whatever services you're getting are no longer available to you?
You're not getting services.
So what happens, like practically, to those people?
You're on your own.
And you can't get back into the
You can get
system?
back in. You would have to enter back into HMIS and ask for help again. But people get so discouraged, right? So you call up, you say, I need help, I'm homeless, this is what's going on in my life, you get nothing. You don't get helped. And so then you just let it fade off. The system is overwhelmed. It's just, and the very fact that we don't know what happens to people is insane. That there's no tracking going on. And that I'm standing up here and saying what I think because of the guys I talk to, I firmly believe it's true. But it's anecdotal.
And I have one other question that's more practical. I see all the time immigrants, they're mainly, or migrants that are mainly women. Sometimes there's like a man with them and children. They're often outside of grocery stores or other things like that. What are the things that people can do to help them? And are those people getting help? And are those kids in school? A lot of times it's during the school day.
Yeah, I don't have a good answer for you. I don't know what the situation is with those people who are out there. I do know, and we do work, the West Side Pantry I was talking about is Mission of Our Lady of Angels on the West Side. In that explosion of people coming into that, the vast majority of them are in school, the kids. The housing situation it's got to be pretty grim because they all list like 4 buildings in which they live. So you're going to have sort of a classic Chicago immigrants jammed into a very small space situation, but they are going to school. Many of the men are already working in the, do we call it the illegal market? I don't know. I mean, 10 to 15% of Chicago is illegal immigrants working. So it's not as though we're new to this. But it's a good question, especially having those kids out there. And it struck me the first time I saw it, because once we were a society that said, we can't have this, right? Go back to the foundation of like, was it Elizabeth Stanton who founded the Chicago Housing Authority? Do we have any historians here? Okay, there was a Chicago woman, and we should look up her name, who just could not stand watching what was happening to children in the slums. And so she took a series of pictures and documented what was going on. And she successfully, and basically people saw it and said, oh my goodness, this is horrible. We have to do something about it. And over a period of time, she was instrumental in creating the housing department, creating zoning codes in the city of Chicago, and forcing improvements in housing. And she is the woman responsible for community planning in Chicago, why we have parks in some of our newer communities, all because of what she did in taking pictures of children and forcing the city leaders at that time to adapt to that. Someone look it up. Metropolitan Housing Council, the founder of that organization. Well, someone look it up, and we'll give give due to this woman who changed Chicago by exactly that, pointing out these are children playing in slums. Yeah.
Well, thank you for the talk and what you do. I had two questions. One of them was with regards to the extra cost that comes for the PSH.
Yeah.
What is that based on? Like, is it just corruption or something else? What is that based on, first of all? And second of all, you said there's one case where the number of shelters were increased by 20,000 or something. You were able to increase, or somebody was able to increase that. Which year was it, and how did that happen?
Yeah, great question. So the reason that affordable housing, the argument given, there's an article in the June 2023 Crane Chicago that will deal with this in more detail. If you want to zero in on it, but there were construction issues. For example, when you hire your general contractor versus when you do the plans, there were cost containment and discipline issues. There were how the design of the buildings, right? So if you build, let's say Sterling Bay, the example I gave, I understand this to be true. I've never built a skyscraper. If you build one stack in the middle with the elevator and everything going up and down it, it's much cheaper than if you build two. And therefore, the one stack that Sterling Bay builds is much less expensive than the smaller spread out buildings that have the same number of units that the city is building. And one important thing in this is financing. So if you're a builder, you go and you get a bridge loan, and then you get a regular loan, you build. There's a series of different finances that have to go into creating these affordable housing. So we are very expensive as a nation in how we do it. The second question you asked, so that's not a detailed answer, but again, I can refer you to some place that you can get a more detailed, which is the Crane's June article, 2023. The question you asked of who put up all those shelter beds, to me, is fascinating, okay? Because in 1 year, 15,000 new beds were added in the city of Chicago. And none of us know exactly what process went into it, because it was a very closed process from the start to the finish. But it's really important, right? Because there may come a time when we have to do this again, and we got to learn those lessons. And if we can't do it for a decade, and these folks can do it in, I sit on the darn committee. I don't know who any of them are. I used to work for Daley. I was chief of staff for an alderman. I have no clue who these people are. But they did it, and that's pretty cool. Now we should take advantage of what they did and use it to serve everybody instead of just one population. I think someone needs to figure this out. Anyone here in media? Okay, well, I'm just saying there's a story to be told in how that happened.
One additional question. So this $100 million, which is being planned as part of the referendum, how much does Chicago spend currently for managing homeless people?
Yeah, good question. I don't know the answer. I don't know what the totals are. It's a very good question.
Thank you so much. Question about, for those who are getting the housing assistance that only covers 3 months, is there any tracking of how many of them are actually able to find a landlord who's willing to only rent to them for 3 months, or how many of them have failed to find housing within the time allowed with their assistance?
Yeah, there is no tracking going on that I know of. You will be getting answers very soon because some of those people will be timing out. So the question of are they staying in that housing becomes very important, and what happens next. I will tell you, in conversations between my staff and my volunteers and people who are looking for housing, the units that they are getting are very challenging.
Right.
Because you've got to get a landlord who's willing to rent to someone who doesn't have a job. And we're mainly dealing with families, right? So the Inn of Chicago is the one I was talking about, which is a large family shelter. Doesn't have a job, has kids, has only 3 months rent covered. So you're going to get landlords who are challenging doing that. There are some examples. There's one guy in the South Side who's opened up 1,000 units. Did anyone else read about this? opened up 4 different buildings to migrants. So maybe that type of philanthropy might be a different model. I don't know him personally, but I think it will be interesting to see what happens with that.
Great, thank you.
Okay, first, some online questions, just gonna ask one. Has Mayor Brandon Johnson responded to the Archdiocese offer of schools for shelters? And the person comments, I've only seen people questioning why not. Do you know what's happening with that?
So I will only give you my perspective, is that I go to I've gone to 3 or 4 different parishes on the south side of Chicago in creating sort of a nexus of community service, which has ended up in Bronzeville. And in a couple of them, the father said, we have a building. I've been in touch with the Archdiocese. We have space. And so and they got nothing back. They said, there's nothing back from the Archdiocese, there's nothing back from anyone. So whatever, and then I found that very interesting, that the Archdiocese didn't just say no, they just didn't reply. And then it turns out that the city didn't reply to the Archdiocese. The whole thing is confusing to me. I do know, on the flip side, Lutheran Church Charities is going ahead and doing this on their own. So sometimes there's a value in not waiting for government to get to this, which I think is pretty cool. I think they have 4 buildings up and running, or 3 or 4, and they're working on some other ones. They're much smaller, they're not schools, but that type of initiative is a way to get at something like this. I have no idea what happened with that, except that nobody seemed to know anything until they said the offer had been rejected.
Thank you for the talk and for what you do. Do you talk much with people who have similar goals and jobs in other cities, and either other cities like Chicago? And Rick also asked, what's going on in Evanston or Skokie or some of the places nearby Chicago. If you just want to comment a little bit about what you see, not necessarily in Chicago, but other cities and around Chicago.
Yeah, so I'm pretty parochial, I'm afraid. I'm very much focused in Chicago, and I don't have relationships outside of the city. But what I will say, and I can't remember how we started looking at this, of asking the question of why do some people do housing first so much better than we do? And there were 2 things that stood out to us. And this is the charge group, the group UIC, Rush, and those other folks, is that there are 2 components of what they do that is what we don't do. The first is they have the units. So they have created the units, they move people into the units. And the second is relationships. So in some of these places, the social workers know the homeless people individually, personally. They know how they're doing. They're checking in on them on a regular basis. And the decision whether or not to move someone into housing when a unit opens up is made by consulting the social workers about who is ready for housing. You can imagine the conversation. Is he taking his meds? Is he sober? Is he, whatever it is, you got a unit open, you want it to succeed, and you want to be able to move people in, use your resources wisely, and help them. And relationships are key, experienced relationships, to identifying who is going to succeed at this. We have this, we do this in Chicago with an algorithm. So you do a long formula, you enter it into a computer, you take all of these variables, and you get a score. And that score determines who gets the unit. We also tend to fail. So we have an expression, 3rd time lucky, which means the first time I put you in housing, it's gonna fail. The second time we put you in housing, it's gonna fail, and we hope that it sticks the 3rd time. And the biggest single reason for failing is relationships. People are lonely. If I take you out of the River North and I put you in Auburn Gresham, you got no friends. You're going to go back to your friends, and that's the biggest single reason for failure. So relationships, both between people, connections with people, ameliorate that issue of loneliness. If you know your social worker and they know you, it's a much better opportunity for success than if we're just plugging you into an algorithm and plopping you in a unit. So I wish I knew more, but I don't. But those are the things that we found.
Thank you for your presentation. My question is, you put up some numbers where you raised the question about how you define homelessness.
Yeah.
I'd like to ask the question of how we define homes. there's lots of different structures, and it seems like the question about the SROs was brought up, and you mentioned the issue about the tents. We have so many regulations, either from the federal level and particularly at the local level, about what a house is or what goes into a house. And it seems to me, in my experience, both in civic work and professionally, that we eliminate a lot of opportunities for viable shelter because we create all these prescriptive regulations. From your perspective, what are some opportunities that we can do to adjust that to get to the kind of housing that meets the needs of specific populations and that would help to alleviate this problem?
Yeah, it's certainly home is a lot more than just the construction around it. It's the community around you, the people you're connected to, the things you do. Just to follow that up, we started a meal at Holy Trinity Cathedral, which is right next to Humboldt Park. And it's only about 30 or 40 people that come. Sometimes if the migrants show up, that doubles, but usually it's just homeless. Every single person who comes to that meal is from that community. It's their home. They might be sleeping in an alley, they might be outside, but that's where they want to be and they don't leave. And it was one of the things that created our belief of training people at those meals to help those people at that location, because they're not going downtown or anywhere else to get services. They want to stay there, and they prefer staying there to going to some of the other locations to get things. So we had to bring it to where they are. You also raise an interesting question about physically defining homes, right? Because there are encampments along the Dan Ryan that have been there for 40 years. So they're not new. They're 4 decades old. Some of the tents are new, but the existence of those encampments are not. And in one of those encampments, you may have known Orange Tent just put up a tiny home. It's an interesting story. So IIT, some students there designed it. They had planned to build it in one morning. It took a little bit longer. They didn't get it finished, and the city slapped a stop work order on it. And so what's the difference between a tent and a tiny home? Well, for the people who are living there, they were fired up because they felt this was much safer. I think it is. You know, tents are intrinsically vulnerable. This is a little bit safer. It has a little bit more continuity. There was no electricity. Well, there was a solar panel on top of it, so they could charge their phones and have a light and a few things like that, but that was it. No gas lines, none of it. Why is that different from a tent? And the gentleman who was supposed to move in and ended up not moving in, and there's a couple of articles about this, he's an older gentleman, and he was gung-ho. He said he was going to move in anyways. He didn't care what the city did. And Morgan and Orange Tent eventually put the kibosh on it because she was afraid he was going to do just that he was going to move into the structure. He's an older, disabled gentleman, and she was afraid he was going to get hurt when the city moved him out. So she took down the structure. But that's a perfect example of like an opportunity to make people more safe, more secure, warmer in the winter. It's problematic. Do we really want sort of the third world shanty towns growing up in Chicago? But on the other hand, it's better than freezing to death. So I do think your comment is really apropos, that a home is different than a house.
Thank you.
Thank you for your talk. I was wondering if you encounter people that are trying to help homeless by changing regulations and zoning to increase the amount of market rate housing that is built.
Yeah.
Does that overlap with the work that you people do?
Oh, goodness, yes. Sorry.
So, and also, I understand there's some things in Springfield that are relevant for that are in motion?
I don't know about
Some people
it.
are trying to change some things like that.
Yeah. So, I mean, Chicago has some pretty strict zoning codes about what you can and you can't build. For example, where you can do coach houses, who can live in basements, what constitutes a habitable unit. And I would say that the origin of those codes is the 1950s, after World War II, when we had booming suburbs and places for people to go, and there hadn't been significant construction in the city of Chicago since the Great Depression in 1929, all the way through the end of World War II. So there was significant jams of people were crowded into units. We get the expression an in-law unit. And so the city decided it was going to what's the word I want? Will lessen the density within neighborhoods, that it was just too much, and so it passed a series of these rules. And it really is time to revisit that and say, look, Does this make sense? The other point I would add to that, and now you're going to realize that years and years ago I was an urban planner, is that the Chicago model had high-density buildings on the corners and then lower density as you went into the middle, creating a community in which you could live your whole life, right? So you're a young couple, you're going to live in the higher density apartments. Maybe later on you go buy a house, but you can stay in the area and stay in that, but communities that have, and there's a greater variety available and greater variety of cost to housing in that model. But communities that only have single-family homes, or for example, price out a vast number of people who might want to live in that area, and there isn't the same set of opportunities if that's what we're building.
Okay, another question online. How much would universal basic income help? We hear the stereotype of homeless people who have access to sudden money, wasting it on drugs and such. I doubt that's true, but what are your thoughts?
So I would give you a mixed answer. I have seen people do extraordinarily stupid things with money. So there's sometimes a reason that you're homeless, and judgment can be one of them. So that's one thing. However, on an aggregate level, when we talk about basic income, what the studies show you is when people get windfalls of money like that, the vast majority of people, so don't start thinking about the small percentage that I just cracked a joke about. Think about what happens in aggregate. People spend money on things like rent, very consistently. That's one of the biggest. They get housing. The next thing that people spend money on, it applies less to my guys than it does to the population in general, to that 68,000, is their kids. They buy their kids school supplies. They get their kids into schools. So the studies show that when you give basic income to people who are poor, they spend it on exactly the things you want them to spend it on. And that speaks to the 68,000 as opposed to the 6,000 to 8,000 that have judgment issues and aren't going to make good use of it.
I'm going to ask another question came online. How do you think about person-to-person donations? Example of giving money to people on the train or at the bottom of the ramp on the highway. Does this help the person receiving the money, or is it better to go through more formal channels?
So I'm an advocate for more formal channels because people are in that situation for a reason, and getting help is absolutely essential to change that reason. If they could have managed it themselves, in many instances they would have. We actually do a resource guide. I wish I had one right now. It's distributed. It's an interesting little product. It shows you where to get social services, where to get meals, how to get into shelters, a whole series of things that a homeless person might need. And the idea is that if you connect them into the system, they have a better chance of getting out of that system than if you just give them money. So that I'm absolutely, initiatives like that that connect people to the things they need to change their lives are better than just continuing the process they're in.
Hi, thank you for your talk. That's my brother there.
Really?
Hey, Jay. Anyways, I did most of my work in Inglewood, actually. I've been a hard money lender for coming up on 34 years. And when I was hearing you talking about, I don't know, this is more of a comment than a question, but when you're talking about regulations and things the city has done, I've kind of seen over the years less investment in Inglewood by individuals because they've done things, particularly after the housing loan crisis in 2008-9. They thought they're protecting the little guy, but they've, like there's relocations if you foreclose a property, or the landlords have a hard time evicting people, and there's a lot of protections for that, but it really discourages investment by individuals and also lenders to want to get in there. Some of these less costly properties in Inglewood, if you need to evict them and you need to throw them out, you've got to give them over $10,000 in relocation fees. And for small time, not valuable properties, it discourages people rehabbing these properties.
Yeah.
And so that's one thought. And then the other thought, being in a place like this where you get a lot of people who do care about social issues, how do we get people who don't care. And I do talk to a lot of people who don't care about people who, you know, they've fallen through the cracks for whatever reasons. And I think it's to think about how do you make it important to most everyone rather than the people who already do care.
Yeah, I think, so to go to your first question, I'm going to tell you, or comment, I'm going to tell you a little story. When I was chief of staff to an alderman, we chose to shut down one of the buildings in Uptown because it was just a total disaster. And the city fought us on it. They said, you can't do this, where are these people going to go? Had a staff member at that time, his name was Dana Fritz, and he worked with UBA, the Edgewater Uptown Builders Association, and most of the landlords. And he went around and he talked to every landlord until he had a place for every single person who would be coming out of that building. And the city was scared to death that they were going to end up on the street and they were going to have a media catastrophe over this. Not one single person ended up outside because of Dana. What was it? It was his relationship with the building owners. They trusted him. They knew if it went bad or that there was an issue that we weren't going to come down on them, that we were asking them to do something for these people and that they would do their very best. And it's that type of a dynamic that moves us forward, one of trust and working mutually towards the same goals. And the dynamics that get put in place, for example, that you talked about, can actually be impediments. Because if Dana hadn't been there, then the decision we would have had to make was, do we shut down this building where they're selling drugs and there are gunfights out of the front lobby and put these people homeless, or do we let that go on because we don't want to make these people homeless? But we didn't have to make that choice. And you're talking about the same thing, which is that on the one hand, you've got a set of regulations that make moving people out very difficult, so it lessens investment. On the other hand, you don't want a situation in which people just get tossed. What was the second question?
Well, it's just more of the thought that there, with something like this, you have people who care. But I talk to people who, I'm not going to say what politics they're into, but they don't care about these issues. And how can we make people say, I can see why this is good for society and good for me and makes sense? Because we're going to take care of these people. That's going to happen. Or at least we're going to be spending money on it. And do you want your money spent well or poorly? Do you want to do it once, twice, or 3 times? How much do you want to spend to get this done? Because as a society, at least in the majority, at least in the way we speak, not always in the way we act, we want this issue addressed. Right. And I do think that Chicago is becoming a more progressive city. I think we've had some fits and starts in that direction, and I think it's a good thing. So that's the answer. You're going to do it anyways. What do you want to pay for it?
One last question, because I feel like it's worth asking. If you felt like you had a unit and wanted to contribute to this, is there a way, or is this just a bad idea? So you're saying, I have a apartment in my house and nobody's using it. I have a vacant room. I would help with this situation. Is there a way forward, or this is just dangerous and a bad thought that is? Do you follow the question? Yeah.
Do you have
like you said, Lutheran General?
Yeah.
I mean, Lutheran
Church
Social Services is doing it on their own.
Yeah, but but let me draw a quick contrast here. They are setting up sets of people within these churches to help this person monitor this, and they are a wider oversight agency if something goes wrong. You don't have that option, Rick. So I think it's probably a bad idea. I think there are some sets of ideas that have to be dealt with collectively versus individually. And this is one of them, because, and it has to do, when we talk about like SROs, the question from before, is like SROs, running an SRO is not easy, and running it well is very hard. And if you think you can do it, think again. You need years of experience to make that work, and years of practice. So just going into that business would be a disaster if you don't have that. And the collective action can help to provide that oversight and that capacity in a way that for individuals it's really tricky.
Well, thank you again. Okay, so we're going to put some announcements overhead. Much thanks to Doug Fraser for speaking with us today. Very interesting, lots to do, lots to think about. So I actually can't see it on the screen. So I'm going to back up. I got to I got it on a piece of paper. Okay, announcements. So Sunday coffee hour, please join us for coffee hour each week after the Sunday program right now. This is an opportunity to catch up with old friends and welcome new faces. Any contributions can be brought to the kitchen ahead of the program. Your help in the kitchen once in a while is greatly appreciated. Please see Sue Hurley to volunteer. Our next community chat will be on Wednesday, March 27th at 7 p.m. We share friendship, issues of the day, and fun in a caring Zoom chat. Join us to connect and appreciate and enjoy each other's company. Sunday, March 24th, next Sunday that is. Spring is right around the corner, or it seems to have arrived, and it's time to tidy up our space inside and out. Join us for this working community day next Sunday, March 24th, when we'll clean up our gardens and grounds, organize some of our indoor storage. Our building committee will have a list of tasks for all ages dressed for the weather. In 2 weeks, there will not be a Sunday program on March 31st. And then on April 7th, Sunday, April 7th, we'll have another ethical dilemmas discussion led by EHS member Carrie Ost. We will consider several potential situations which pose a difficult choice, either of which may mean violating one's sense of right and wrong. We'll break into small groups to examine how we might respond and then share our answers. Following that program, we'll have another newcomers chat. Our membership committee invites you to join us for this informal chat to learn more about our community, our activities, and how to get involved. For more details on upcoming Sunday morning programs and other activities, see our website, ethicalhumanistsociety.org, and connect with us on Facebook, Instagram. Subscribe to our YouTube channel for videos of past speakers and future streaming programs. And a final closing remark from Eleanor Roosevelt: since you get more joy out of giving joy to others, you should put a good deal of thought into the happiness that you are able to give. Thank you.